Okay, ladies and gentlemen. So, for those of you who are watching, thanks for tuning in. We are just kind of doing a quick overview of the 2020 election and presidential elections in general. So, you guys have a little bit of a clue of either what you're watching over the next couple of days and understand, some of the topics that are coming up because the presidential election is a little bit confusing. So, we're breaking this down into three things. How do we elect a president? Then we're going to look at who the two major candidates are, Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and what to know about them. That's going to be a tough job for me to try and stay as unbiased as possible, but we're going to try and break down, what is good and bad possibly about each candidate. And then we're going to look at what happens after the election, so you have a good idea of what takes place after the election's over. All right, so obviously don't copy anything down. You're just listening. How do we elect the president of the United States? So we elect the president of the United States through something called the Electoral College. Now, it's a lot different of a system than actually just what you're probably used to with voting. All right, when people vote, usually what they do is they take the winner of a vote, and then that particular winner of the vote will become the leader of something. So that is known as the popular vote. So if there's 30 students in a class and 18 of them vote for one thing, 12 vote for the other, usually your teachers are going to go with the majority, and the people that want to that were the number 18 will eventually become the winner, okay, for whatever they wanted. So what the Electoral College is, I'm going to use some diagrams to kind of help you, but basically each state, okay, we have a total of 50 states, each state gets a certain number of electoral votes. All right, and I'll show you with the map how that kind of works. But out of our 50 states, depending on their population, each state gets more votes than others. All right. And what each president is trying to do is they're trying to win as many states as possible, as opposed to winning as many people as possible. All right. So the rule of thumb is there's 538 electoral votes. If you can get to the number 270, you win the presidential election. To win a state's electoral vote, though, you need to win the popular vote of that state. So let's say New York, if 4 million people vote for Joe Biden and 3.8 million people vote for Trump, that means Joe Biden is going to win New York's electoral votes number. Okay, and I'll show you what this means in a second. All right, so in a popular vote, this is how you elect governors, mayors, people in the House of Representatives, class presidents. I mean, you guys voted for class president last year, most likely, or vice president. And what you're doing is you're just taking the popular vote. Okay, so that's the total of number of votes for a particular side. So the example I use, if 18 people vote for pizza as the best food and 16 people vote for hamburgers, pizza has 18 popular votes. All right, that's the total number of people that voted for pizza. Electoral votes are a number that is given to the winner of a state's popular vote. So if 18 people vote for pizza as the best food and 16 people vote for hamburgers, that means pizza now has one electoral vote. All right. So let's use this map to kind of explain how this works here. So each state is going to have a number. The numbers aren't random. It's based off of the state's representation in Congress. So what that means is we have a total here of based on a state's population. So the more people you have in your state, the higher your number. So let's start with New York. We have a pretty big population, one of the biggest populations in the country, and we have a total of 29 electoral votes. Okay, so that means we have a total of 2 people in our Senate, 27 people in our House of Representatives. When you add the two together, we get 29. Therefore, presidents, when they're running for presidential election, are trying to win the majority of votes in that state. If they win the majority of votes in our state, they're going to win 29 electoral votes. And as you go on, you have some states that are pretty big as well, like California has 55. That's the biggest state. Texas is pretty big with 38. Florida is 29. And then you have some smaller states where they're not worth quite as much. You got like South Dakota here, Nebraska 5, Wyoming 3, Idaho 4. If you look at the Northeast, Vermont has 3, New Hampshire has 4. So this electoral vote is basically trying to bring together, all right, as many states as possible. Now, we'll go into how this kind of looks here. We're not going to go into really why the Electoral College maybe is a little bit controversial, but we'll look at this example here. So we're going to review the 2016 election to help us understand the 2020 election going forward. So as you can see here, the numbers are still the same. If a state ended up voting in majority for Trump, they are in red. And if they voted in majority for Hillary Clinton, they are in blue. All right. So what you kind of notice here is there was more total states that voted probably for Trump here. Okay, because you can tell it was close to 30 states when it was all said and done. And then there was probably closer to 20 states that voted for Hillary Clinton, and they are in blue. All right. So since Trump had won more states and racked up more electoral votes, he is going to win the presidential election. Now, every so often, it can happen where the presidential winner does not win the popular vote. And that's what happened in 2016. So in this case, Hillary Clinton had 64 million people vote for her, where Donald Trump had only 62 million people vote for him. All right. But since the election is not based off of the amount of total people who voted, it's based on the wider range of states who voted and trying to win the states. Therefore, Trump won the presidential election. All right. So the Electoral College can be controversial from that standpoint, but essentially, the Electoral College was put into place to make sure that all of the states had some sort of representation. Even South Dakota or Wyoming, who aren't the biggest states, Alaska, all right, Hawaii, these states aren't the biggest numbers. There's an opportunity for them to have more of a say in a presidential election. If you had just gone with the popular vote, the founding fathers, when they created the Constitution, if you had just gone with the popular vote, well, then that's going to mean that some of these states, like we just mentioned, won't have as much of a say. In fact, they won't really have any much of a say. And there's this like pretty famous thing that if you were to win the states of California, Florida, Texas, New York, if you were just to win those 4 states with 70% of the vote, getting most of the vote, you could lose the 46 other states and still become president if you just use the popular vote, because so many people live in California, Florida, New York, Texas. All right. So here's a good example of how it kind of looks here. So let's start with New York. So in 2016, Hillary Clinton won 58% of the votes. Donald Trump won 37% of the votes. Therefore, Hillary Clinton wins all 29 electoral votes from New York. Okay, so since she won New York, she gets all 29 votes, and that goes to her score. All right. But depending on the state, sometimes the outcome's different. So in Wisconsin, you could tell was pretty close. Donald Trump got 48% of the votes. Hillary Clinton got close to 47. All right. He ends up winning Donald Trump 10 electoral votes. So he gets all 10 electoral votes. Another great example here is, right, this is one of the closest ones, the state of Michigan. Michigan's located right here, 16 electoral votes, 16 points. Trump barely won. He got 47.6% of the vote. Hillary Clinton got 47.3% of the vote. But guess what? Our Constitution says Donald Trump gets all of the electoral votes. Now, you see how Trump barely won in some of these states, racked up 26 electoral votes, where Hillary Clinton in New York blew out Donald Trump and got very much the same amount of electoral votes. So winning the entire state is the goal. Okay, so it could be by one vote. If Trump was to win Michigan by one total vote, let's say 3,000,001 to 3 million, Trump still gets all 16 electoral votes. So trying to win as many states as possible to rack up as many points as possible is the best way to understand how the Electoral College looks. So if you're watching the election Tuesday night and you're trying to see, okay, Trump won this state or Biden won this state, you're using the Electoral College to try and add up the numbers as best as possible. All right. So the 2020 candidates, okay, for those that don't know, it is Donald Trump, who is our current president, versus Joe Biden, who is the person he is running against. Just to quickly go over some things, what does a president actually do? Because it's actually it's a very tough job, obviously, but it's a complicated job. There's multiple things that a president does. All right. The main thing is, of course, they want to enforce the laws, make sure that we're being protected and enforce the laws. But he also has to work with other countries, the president. They have to make sure that our relationships with other countries are good. He has to act as what's called our head of state. He needs to make sure that he is acting appropriately and acting as a responsible citizen and rewarding our national heroes or anyone that does great things. If there's a war, he goes in control of the military. He can use the military to his advantage when the military is needed for certain situations. All right. He's in charge of the economy, okay, making sure that our economy is up and running and working well. And he is, of course, making sure that our laws are being enforced. So presidents have a lot of different things that they could do. All right. Specifically, what makes voting for president so tough is there's a lot of different things. Now, we've had 45 presidents. Very rarely is a president going to be good at all 7 of these things that you're looking at. Most of the time, like every president, they do some good things and they do some bad things. And they're stronger at some things than other things. So in this particular case, you have to look at what's important to you as a voter when you guys get older. Would you rather be making sure that we're protected and safe? Or would you rather be making sure our economy is good? All right. It's really up to you as a voter what's important, and you should probably pick the person that is strongest with that. All right. So presidents have difficult jobs, and every single president we've had has been good in some things and bad in some things. And trying to figure out if so-and-so is a good president. Was Donald Trump a good president? Was Barack Obama a good president? Was George Washington a good president? Those are very complicated questions to answer. They did some good things, and then hopefully you could cite the good things that they did. And they probably did some not so good things, and you could cite the bad things that they didn't do. All right, so voting for president's tough from that standpoint. So this is the tough part, but I'm going to try and teach this as unbiasedly as possible. I'm going to try and say, okay, if you're a Trump supporter or you're voting for Trump, these are some things they might say. And if you're someone who disliked Trump and not voting for them, what are some things they might say? All right, to give you an idea of kind of what's good and what's bad. Now, this is just a general list. It can go into a lot more detail with some of these topics. And there's obviously some things that I'm not mentioning because I don't want to be here forever. All right, so if someone liked Trump and was voting for him, what might they say? Well, first thing they might say is he's not a typical politician. And since he's not a typical politician, people believe that it will be able to do more for the country than other people that are usually in charge. All right, so they're a fan of him not being someone that's been in government a long time. People that are Trump supporters usually will point at his foreign policy record, meaning the way he works with other countries. It's been pretty good, but for the most part, according to them. And he's the first president, I think, since 1940 where America has not fought in a war. So for almost 80 years, we've been in some sort of war. Every president has been a part of some sort of war, some bigger than others. But he's the first president where we haven't fought in a war. So that would probably be a good thing. When he was president, his first 4 years, the economy did very well. Some would say maybe the best in American history. Once the pandemic hit, it kind of faltered down because we had to close everything down. So the economy was kind of hurting. But ultimately, over time, things did get a little bit better and have been getting better. And many people believe that if he stays as president, our economy will continue to be really good. All right. So those are just some general things. If someone disliked Trump and was not voting for him, what might they say? So one thing is the way he acts as a president is very unusual. His behavior, his speeches, his tweets, and his attitude, many people would say is not the way a president should handle themselves and not the way the president should act. So Trump's a good example if you're looking at the slide before. Trump would probably be better as a chief diplomat or maybe a commander-in-chief than he would as the head of state, okay, the way he carries himself. All right, so that's me trying to be unbiased. He did some good things with foreign policy, but the way he carries himself, not as good. He's not taken the COVID pandemic as seriously as he should. And when I say that, I mean, not necessarily that he's not, trying to stop people from, he's obviously trying to make sure the pandemic goes away, but the way he carries himself and the fact that he doesn't really ever wear a mask or the fact that his supporters and his people are not social distancing is just a bad example that has been set. And many people are upset that he is not at least saying it to be a little bit worse than it is. All right. The next thing, he has failed to acknowledge and support a lot of progressive movements. Things like Black Lives Matter has been pretty big in the news lately. Climate change has been pretty big in the news. And he hasn't really been speaking out against it. All right, he hasn't really been supportive of it. Obviously, systemic racism is a huge topic in our country. It's very controversial in our country, and Donald Trump hasn't really spoken much about it. Many people also believe that some of his policies and his speeches and the things he says are racist, so people may not vote for Trump because they believe him to be racist. All right. Moving on to the next candidate, Joe Biden. All right. If someone liked Joe Biden, and was voting for him, what might they say? Well, number one, he has a much calmer way about him. His character generally is a lot better, according to people. His character is a lot better. He's a lot more relatable in terms of the way he carries himself and the way a president, quote unquote, should act. And many people believe that things will be more normal if he's in charge. He has taken COVID extremely seriously. He's usually always wearing a mask, and he's always socially distancing. He's always talking about COVID. And I'm not quite sure what his plan would be to do anything differently. But I think the fact that he, at least on the outside, takes it a lot more seriously is very important to a lot of voters. So many people would be voting for him for that. He's been a lot more outspoken on progressive movements such as Black Lives Matter and climate change, and people that are very into Black Lives Matter are very worried about climate change. And when I say Black Lives Matter, of course, the saying, of course, all Black Lives Matter, but I'm talking more about the organization. The organization's a little bit more controversial, but his stance on Black Lives Matter is that he's very much for it, and is obviously talking about climate change a lot more. And he's just kind of been more aware of some systemic racism things in the country. If someone disliked Biden and was not voting for him, what might they say? Well, he's been in government for 47 years. He's been a senator. He's been the vice president under Barack Obama. And he's done very few consequential or important things. It's very tough to highlight what he's done well or hasn't done well, because he hasn't just done that much. And some of the biggest things he has done, he's actually moved away from and has not been happy with. All right, one example is he had a crime bill in 1994, which he has since moved away from. That was one of the biggest things he's done in government, but now has moved away from because he believes that it has actually hurt the African-American community. Number two, Joe Biden will be 78 years old. He will be the oldest president if he's elected, and is not as sharp as he used to be. If you look at a speech from him 30 years ago and a speech from him now, he definitely stutters over a lot of words. He definitely is not as with it as he used to be. So many people are worried about that. Can he sustain a presidency, which is a really tough job? You're constantly working. Will he be able to sustain that and be an effective president? Many people also believe that he will not run the country as much because he is a little bit older. So he's going to give more power to his vice president and his Democratic Party, which worries some people, because a lot of people are worried about the vice president and Democratic Party at times. His views on foreign policy in the past and his views on certain wars have generally been incorrect. So people worry going forward, not saying he can't get it right going forward, but if he's been incorrect on things like the Persian Gulf War or things with Osama bin Laden, for those that know a little bit of our history with wars. Therefore, our military may be weaker under this presidency, so people are a little bit worried about that. All right, so you have two candidates here. There's a lot that goes into them. If you were just to say, I don't like Trump because he's racist, and you were to say, I don't like Biden because he's old, that's too overly simplistic. You got to try and make sure you're looking at their policies, comparing that to how they are as a person, and seeing what's the most important thing to you. If someone could tell you in one sentence who they're voting for, they don't know enough of the person. If someone's not voting for Biden because he's too old and that's all they could say about that, that's a problem. If someone could say they're not voting for Trump because he's racist and that's all he could say, that's a problem. So you need to try and educate yourself going forward as an adult. You know, if you are going to vote, who are you going to vote for? You have to try and view both sides of it as much as possible and as unbiasedly as possible. The last thing I just want to go over, what happens after the election. So if Trump does get that 270 vote or more number for the electoral votes, he will win and he will continue his presidency into the year 2024. However, he will not be able to run for president again. There's no way he can run for a third term. So this is his last chance to be president. If Biden gets 270 or more electoral votes, it becomes a little bit more confusing. He will become known as what's called the president-elect for 2.5 months. So for 2.5 months, he will be transitioning to become president, getting everything ready, getting his staff ready, getting his policies ready. Just like you guys might transition and go to a new subject in school, you gotta get your books together and your mind right. We give the president-elect 2.5 months to do that. So Trump, even though if he loses the election, can still be president, will still be president, excuse me, until January 20th, 2021. Then Biden will take over on that date until the year 2024. And if Biden wants to run again, he can do that if he chooses to, because this is only his first term. How will life change if Trump or Biden wins? Well, depending on who you ask, they may have differing answers. But honestly, it won't change too much, especially for a middle school student. If Trump wins or if Biden wins, the country is really not going to change as a whole too much. There will be plenty of people upset. There will be some changes that go on, but I don't think it's enough for you to really notice anything. The media coverage will be intense. They will be very upset or very happy, depending on the person that they want to win. But overall, our country will move on a very similar path as it always has been. All right. And for you guys as middle school students and young adults, basically, it's not something that's going to affect your life in grave detail. It's not like you have to worry too much. But to a lot of people, this is a very, very important election. I've heard many people say that this is the most important election in modern American history. And there's a lot. There's very passionate people about this. So my final election thoughts are this. It is generally rude to ask a teacher or a friend or someone you know who they're voting for, so try not to. I also think it's rude for a teacher to be telling you who they voted for outright. That should be left up to you to decide. Whether you vote for Trump or Biden or you don't vote, that's completely fine. But it's not something you should be kind of telling everyone. It's pretty bad etiquette. So if you've been going around asking teachers who they voted for, try not to do that. It's generally rude. Some teachers don't mind telling you, and it's fine if they tell you to ask, but you shouldn't be asking them. It's kind of something that should be kept private, as talking about politics and who they voted for is very controversial to some people. Now, for me as a social studies teacher, it doesn't matter to me. Okay, if a student asks me and they really want to know and they're dying to know, I don't mind telling them, but I really think it's not something you should be doing. All right. Number two, understand the role of president is very complicated. So try and judge candidates on all of the things a president does as opposed to one thing. All right. Because if you're just voting for president based on one thing they do, you're missing the 100 other things that could also happen. All right. And understand that they're good and bad at certain things. All right. So you have to kind of try and predict what they will be best at. All right. They're as good as Presidents George Washington and Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt and Ronald Reagan are. They were not perfect. They had their flaws, and it's very tough to be good at everything. Many adults are taking this election very seriously, and many people will be upset in the days and weeks after the election if their candidate loses. They also may be very happy if their candidate wins. So if you're around adults, maybe just kind of keep that in mind when you're around the adults. But ultimately, our country is going to move forward together. The last thing, and this is probably the most important thing I'll say, so I'm leaving it towards the end. If someone you know is voting for the candidate you don't like, so if you like Trump and someone's voting for Biden, or if someone likes Biden and they're voting for Trump, that's okay. All right. That shouldn't change your relationship with them. That shouldn't really change anything about them. People have different viewpoints, especially when it comes to who should be president. And being accepting of that is more important than anything else in the election. All right. There are family members that don't speak because they voted for different people. There are friends that don't speak because they voted for different people. And you need to understand, no matter who the president is, the president doesn't run the country. The president runs the executive branch of government. The people of the United States run the country. We're the ones that run it. So when we act bad and we treat each other not as well, that is a reflection on us not doing a good job running our country. All right, if we're accepting of people, you don't have to agree. I'm not saying you have to agree, but you need to be accepting and understanding that there are people with different viewpoints. And with everything else in the election, understanding these people are important. All right. So no matter what happens, 80 million people are going to vote for Biden, 80 million people are going to vote for Trump. It's not realistic, I don't think, to say, okay, you voted, the 80 million people that voted for this candidate, we don't like them anymore. I think that's so childish, and hopefully you guys realize that's not the way to act as you guys are getting older. And the problem is many adults act that way at times, and it's very disheartening sometimes when we're going through this stuff as an election. All right? But that's all I have. If you have any questions, you guys could post in the comments, or let me know if you have any particular questions. But those are the general thoughts of the 2020 election and how the elections go. Please keep in mind, if you're just watching on Tuesday, how to vote for particular candidates. Just you're counting up the electoral votes, you're trying to win the states, and each state will give you a certain number. So maybe screenshot this or watch the news. You'll see a very similar map going forward. All right. I hope you guys have a good rest of your Tuesday, and I'll see you guys in school tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.